James Callaghan thought he could stay invisible in Liverpool, moving millions in cash and luxury goods while no one watched. But behind the sleek watches, diamond-studded jewelry, and piles of untraceable money, a web of crime was unraveling. One that would shock the city and expose a fortune built on secrecy and deception. Liverpool had always been a city of contrasts. Its historic docks whispered of centuries of trade and commerce, while its streets bore the marks of modern struggle, abandoned warehouses, graffiti-strewn alleyways, and neighborhoods that seemed frozen in time. Beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life, however, there was another world, a world that few outsiders ever glimpsed, where money moved in ways that were hidden, dangerous, and often illegal. In that world, one man had managed to carve out a place for himself, a place built on secrecy, cunning, and a skill that made him almost untouchable: money laundering. At first it was subtle. Neighbors noticed new cars parked outside modest homes, sleek vehicles that seemed far beyond the owner's means. Small businesses, once struggling to keep the lights on, suddenly flourished overnight. There were whispers of expensive vacations, private clubs, and luxury items appearing without explanation. The people living around him didn't ask too many questions. It wasn't their business, and in Liverpool, curiosity could sometimes be dangerous. Authorities, however, were paying attention. Financial crimes leave trails, even if they're faint and tangled. And the man behind it all had left just enough breadcrumbs to attract scrutiny. Investigators began connecting dots that at first seemed unrelated. Unusual bank deposits, rapid turnovers in businesses, and purchases of high-end watches and rare jewelry that didn't match any legitimate income. Each observation deepened the mystery. Who was this person, and how had he built such a fortress of wealth? What made him so difficult to trace was his meticulous planning. Every transaction, every purchase, seemed calculated to avoid detection. He operated with a precision that made him almost invisible, a ghost in plain sight. Police had reports of him attending auctions for luxury watches, using shell companies to mask the true source of funds. He never flaunted his wealth publicly, yet it always seemed just within reach. A gleaming watch here, a diamond bracelet there. These symbols of wealth became part of the puzzle for investigators, each one a clue pointing toward the intricate network he had built over years. The city itself seemed to play a part in the man's scheme. Liverpool's sprawling industrial districts, once the heartbeat of global trade, now offered countless opportunities to hide financial activity. Storage units, quiet offices tucked away behind bustling streets, and unassuming properties became his shields. To the casual observer, these were ordinary places, but for the police, they were hints of a larger, hidden operation. As the investigation began to take shape, a portrait of the launderer emerged. Not a violent criminal, but someone far more dangerous in other ways. He had no need for guns or brute force. His weapon was information, and his battlefield was finance. He understood the way money moved, how accounts could be manipulated, and how to exploit loopholes in the system. His skill made him untouchable for years, and even law enforcement had to tread carefully, aware that one misstep could allow him to vanish like smoke. Months passed as authorities watched, documented, and waited. It was a slow and painstaking process, requiring patience and precision. Every small clue had to be analyzed, every movement traced. At times, it felt like chasing shadows, a frustrating pursuit where the man always seemed one step ahead. Yet with each passing week, the noose began to tighten. His network, complex and vast, was beginning to show cracks, and soon, those cracks would lead to discoveries that no one could have anticipated. Discoveries that would shock the city and reveal a world of crime hidden behind the glittering facade of wealth. Liverpool had seen many criminals, many schemes, but this case was different. It was a story, not of violence, but of cunning. A story of someone who had turned secrecy and sophistication into a fortune that few could imagine. And it was only just beginning. The breakthrough came slowly, almost imperceptibly. Investigators had been following the faintest of trails, scattered hints that only made sense when pieced together. It was in the small, quiet details that the pattern finally emerged. Luxury watch auctions, once a pastime of enthusiasts, suddenly became a focal point for the investigation. Certain high-end timepieces and rare jewelry kept reappearing, sold and resold through a maze of shell companies and untraceable buyers. On the surface, these transactions appeared ordinary, wealthy collectors purchasing items of value, but behind them was a much darker story. The launderer had mastered the art of turning illicit cash into tangible symbols of success. A watch worth tens of thousands of pounds could be moved, traded, or sold, all while concealing its criminal origins. Jewelry, rare coins, and even antique artifacts were carefully acquired, catalogued, and hidden away, creating a vault of wealth almost unimaginable in scale. Every purchase told a story, not of frivolity, but of methodical strategy. For the police, understanding that strategy became crucial. Each item was a breadcrumb leading back to the intricate network that supported him. Investigators began mapping out his operations like a complex puzzle. They traced shell companies registered under obscure names, scrutinized bank accounts in multiple countries, and tracked property purchases that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Storage units that appeared mundane to the outside world were actually hidden warehouses of luxury goods, meticulously organized and heavily guarded. The man's operation was not sloppy or reckless. It was precise, almost mechanical. Every step was calculated to avoid detection, yet the very complexity of the system eventually became its weakness. Even more startling was the sheer scale of the operation. Almost £900,000 in watches and jewelry had been amassed, a fortune of glittering items that could have bought luxury homes or sports cars for dozens of people. Alongside that was nearly £255,000 in cash, neatly stacked and stored in ways designed to evade suspicion. Each discovery deepened the sense of awe and disbelief among investigators. The launderer was not just a thief or a criminal, he was a strategist, a mastermind who had constructed an empire of wealth built on the foundations of crime. What set him apart was his understanding of human behavior. He knew the right people to involve, and the right people to keep at a distance. Auctions, private sales, and discreet social gatherings allowed him to operate without drawing attention. Each transaction was a carefully choreographed step in a larger dance, one designed to keep the authorities chasing shadows. At first it seemed almost impossible to pin him down. Each time investigators thought they were close, the trail would vanish, leaving only hints of his presence and whispers of his network. The man's ability to stay ahead of law enforcement made him all the more fascinating and dangerous. He was cautious, yet bold, creative yet methodical. He seemed to anticipate every move, predicting how investigators would respond and adjusting his methods accordingly. It was a game of patience, and the police had to match his cunning with their own. Surveillance teams worked tirelessly, documenting his movements, observing interactions, and following transactions with painstaking care. Every detail mattered, no matter how small, because even a single overlooked clue could unravel the entire operation. As the investigation deepened, the launderer's world began to reveal itself like a slowly unfolding map. Each storage unit, each hidden account, each auction became a piece of a larger story, revealing not just wealth, but a sophisticated criminal mind at work. Authorities began to see patterns, connections between seemingly unrelated purchases, and the flow of money that tied it all together. It was the first real glimpse into the scale of his empire, a web so complex it seemed almost impervious to law enforcement. Yet even as investigators marveled at the precision of the operation, there was an underlying tension. Every move carried risk, and the longer they waited, the higher the stakes became. One wrong step, one premature confrontation, and the man could disappear, taking millions of pounds in cash and luxury goods with him. The closer they got, the more dangerous the game became, and the more thrilling the chase. Liverpool's hidden world of wealth and secrecy was slowly being exposed, one luxury item at a time. What had begun as scattered hints had transformed into a map of crime and cunning, and while the launderer believed himself untouchable, the authorities were closing in, ready to turn his empire of glittering treasures into evidence that could no longer be ignored. Months of careful observation finally began to pay off, but the authorities knew that mere surveillance wouldn't be enough. They needed to get closer, to see the operation from the inside, to understand how the launderer moved his wealth without leaving traces. What followed was one of the most delicate and dangerous phases of the investigation: the undercover operation. Agents posed as buyers, suppliers, and associates, infiltrating the fringes of a network so secretive it seemed impenetrable. Every interaction had to be measured, every move precise, because a single misstep could blow the entire case wide open. The launderer was cautious, almost paranoid. He trusted very few people and rarely conducted business in person. Meetings took place in quiet cafes, dimly lit back rooms, or inside unmarked vehicles parked in deserted streets. Digital communication was encrypted. The scale of the man's operation. The undercover agents uncovered storage units filled with luxury watches, rare jewelry, and expensive collectibles. Some items were insured and documented. Others existed only in the launderer's own private ledgers. The sheer variety and value of the goods were staggering, a physical testament to the success of his methods. The cash involved was equally impressive, hundreds of thousands of pounds moving through accounts, handed off in bundles or carefully concealed for later use. Each discovery brought the investigators closer to understanding the empire he had built. But it also heightened the stakes. The tension of the operation was almost unbearable. Every meeting carried the risk of exposure. Every phone call, every transaction, could have been a trap. Agents had to balance the need for evidence with the constant awareness that their cover could be blown at any moment. Despite these risks, they pressed on, meticulously documenting every detail, recording every movement, and piecing together the complex map of his criminal enterprise. As the months progressed, it became clear that a single misstep by the launderer would unravel the entire network. Yet he remained confident, perhaps even overconfident, believing that the web he had spun was untouchable. Investigators observed his routines, noting the same patterns repeated with almost ritualistic precision: meetings at certain times, deliveries to the same locations, and cash moving along predictable paths. These patterns became the foundation for the next phase of the operation, a plan that would bring the shadow empire into the light. In the quiet moments between surveillance and undercover work, the authorities reflected on the audacity of the criminal they were pursuing. He had created a life of wealth and power while remaining largely invisible, a feat few could have imagined. Yet every empire, no matter how sophisticated, has a breaking point, and the combination of patience, precision, and relentless observation was beginning to expose cracks in the launderer's carefully constructed facade. The stage was set for what would become the defining moment of the investigation. The undercover agents had gathered enough intelligence to plan a coordinated strike, a moment that would bring the entire operation crashing down. For the first time, the authorities could see not only the scale of the crime, but also the man at the center of it. A figure who had thrived in shadows but would soon face a world of consequences he could no longer escape. The day of the raid began quietly, almost deceptively. Rain fell in steady sheets over Liverpool, washing the streets in a grey haze that seemed to mirror the tension among the authorities. Months of surveillance, undercover work, and meticulous planning had led to this moment, yet the danger remained immense. One false move, one wrong decision, and the launderer could vanish, taking millions in cash and luxury goods with him. Every officer involved knew the stakes, and each step had been rehearsed with military precision. Early that morning, a coordinated strike was launched across multiple locations simultaneously. Storage units, modest homes, and unassuming offices, all tied to the launderer, were raided in quick succession. Teams moved silently through corridors and alleyways, ensuring that there would be no time for the suspect to react. As officers entered the first storage unit, the scale of the operation became immediately apparent. Shelves lined with luxury watches gleamed under fluorescent lights, each item carefully catalogued and stored. Cases filled with jewelry, diamond rings, gold bracelets, and precious gemstones were stacked neatly, almost like a private collection in a museum. It was a fortune hidden in plain sight, a visual representation of the meticulous criminal enterprise that had operated in secrecy for so long. In the offices, investigators uncovered ledgers and digital records that detailed the movement of funds. Shell companies were revealed, accounts were traced, and patterns emerged that confirmed years of systematic laundering. It wasn't just the physical evidence that stunned the authorities. It was the level of sophistication. Every transaction had been carefully documented to create the illusion of legitimacy. Cash deposits had been broken into smaller amounts, routed through multiple accounts, and then funneled back into businesses or high-value purchases. Each step had been calculated to avoid detection, and yet, now it was all laid bare. The discovery of nearly £255,000 in cash, hidden in safes and discreet containers, brought a tangible sense of the scale of the operation. Investigators had expected significant sums, but the precision of the stacking, the meticulous separation of denominations, and the care with which the money had been stored reflected the mind behind it. This was not the work of a careless criminal, it was the product of a strategist, someone who understood both the law and its loopholes better than most. The raid also revealed a network of support structures that had allowed the launderer to operate with such confidence. Trusted associates, couriers, and middlemen had facilitated the movement of cash and goods, all while maintaining the secrecy required to avoid law enforcement. It was a web of complicity, carefully woven over years, and it became clear that dismantling it would require more than just seizing assets. The authorities needed to understand the system from top to bottom. The culmination of the operation came when the launderer himself was apprehended. The arrest was swift and without resistance, a testament to both the planning of the authorities and the understanding that escape was no longer possible. In that moment, the months of patient surveillance, the undercover infiltration and the painstaking documentation of transactions converged into a single decisive outcome. As officers catalogued the seized goods, a sense of awe mingled with relief. Nearly £900,000 in luxury watches and jewelry, combined with the cash, represented a staggering level of illicit wealth. Beyond the numbers, however, was the story the evidence told. A story of careful planning, calculated risk, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Liverpool had been home to one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations the authorities had seen in years, and now it had been brought into the light. Even after the raid, questions lingered. How had he managed to operate undetected for so long? Who else had been involved? And what impact would the seizure of such a fortune have on the wider criminal networks he had served? For the investigators, the answers would take time, but one fact was undeniable. The launderer's carefully constructed world had crumbled in a single day, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would ensure justice could finally be pursued. The aftermath of the raid rippled through Liverpool in ways few had anticipated. Newspapers ran headlines detailing the seizure of over £1 million in cash and luxury goods, while local residents struggled to reconcile the ordinary neighborhoods they knew with the hidden criminal empire that had existed in their midst. Investigators, meanwhile, were still in the process of untangling the full scope of the launderer's operations, understanding that this arrest was only the beginning of a much larger story. The evidence collected during the raid painted a vivid picture: stacks of cash neatly arranged in safes, hundreds of thousands of pounds in watches and jewelry, and digital records that mapped the movement of illicit funds with terrifying precision. In court, the scale of the crimes shocked even seasoned prosecutors. Nearly £900,000 in luxury items alone had been accumulated through careful laundering of money derived from organized crime. Coupled with the £254,990 in cash, the total value represented not just personal greed, but an entire network of illegal activity that had quietly thrived beneath the surface of the city. Legal proceedings focused not only on the man himself, but on the system he had built. The network of companies, storage units and intermediaries that enabled such large-scale laundering. Every seized item became more than evidence. It was a symbol of both criminal ingenuity and the vigilance required to dismantle it. The launderer faced a series of charges: From money laundering to operating a network that knowingly concealed the proceeds of crime. Courtrooms were filled with images of his possessions, each luxury watch and diamond ring catalogued and displayed to demonstrate the depth and seriousness of his operations. As the trial unfolded, a pattern became clear. While he had avoided violence and intimidation, his sophistication made him more dangerous than many traditional criminals. His weapon was not fear but strategy, and his battlefield was finance. Every move had been calculated to exploit weaknesses in the law, and yet now, those same calculations had left a trail that law enforcement could follow with remarkable clarity. Beyond the legal ramifications, the raid and trial had a social impact on Liverpool. The case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that wealth displayed in plain sight could mask criminal activity. People began to scrutinize the sudden success of businesses, the flashy purchases in quiet neighborhoods, and the people who seemed untouchable. What had once been whispers of sister became discussions about accountability and vigilance. Authorities emphasized that dismantling such networks required both sophisticated investigative work and public awareness, a lesson learned the hard way through months of painstaking effort. For the man at the center of it all, the consequences were severe. His empire of wealth, built over years of careful planning, had been reduced to evidence in a courtroom. The forfeiture of his assets, £900,000 in luxury goods and nearly £255,000 in cash, marked the tangible loss of power. While the legal proceedings ensured that the criminal record would follow him indefinitely, there was no escape from the structures he had spent so long building. The law had caught up, and the meticulous records that had once protected him now sealed his fate. Yet despite the closure provided by the raid and trial, a lingering sense of unease remained. The case highlighted how sophisticated criminal networks could operate undetected, thriving behind ordinary facades and exploiting the blind spots in society. Investigators knew that this was not the end, but a warning. Money laundering and financial crime required constant vigilance, not only from law enforcement, but from the communities around them. In the end, the story of the Liverpool money launderer became more than a tale of wealth seized and justice served. It was a story of patience, precision, and relentless pursuit. It reminded the city, and anyone who heard the story, that even in familiar streets, shadows could hide vast, complex operations. And while the man's fortune had been taken, and his freedom curtailed, the legacy of the investigation would linger, a testament to the power of careful, determined policing and the truth that no matter how sophisticated, crime eventually leaves a trail that cannot remain hidden forever.